Hello, my name is Jorge Besada, and I am running for Congress in Washington State's 9th District. I'm a computer guy, a contractor at Microsoft. I was born in Cuba, a once prosperous country destroyed by economic fallacies which led many to adopt socialism and thus inadvertently bring oppression and poverty upon themselves. To a significant degree, I was raised by my grandmother, a botanist who was a firm believer in socialism. She was a great woman in countless ways, but she was wrong about socialism and how the social economic order works. The great free market economist Ludwig von Mises felt it was quote-unquote the primary civic duty to spread an understanding of economics, of the so-called free market, of real capitalism. I see things likewise. I too see it as my moral duty to help others overcome the economic fallacies that continually take us towards tribalistic wars and economic disasters. So I would like to begin this introductory campaign video by quoting the great Mises, which will nicely capture the essence of my campaign. Quote, "Economics must not be relegated to classrooms and statistical offices, and must not be left to esoteric circles. It is the philosophy of human life and action and concerns everybody and everything. It is the pith of civilization and of man's human existence. All present-day political issues concern problems commonly called economic. All arguments advanced in contemporary discussion of social and public affairs deal with fundamental matters of economics. Everybody's mind is preoccupied with economic doctrines. Everybody thinks of economics whether he's aware of it or not. In joining a political party and in casting his ballot, the citizen implicitly takes a stand upon essential economic theories. As conditions are today, nothing can be more important to every intelligent man than economics. His own fate and that of his progeny is at stake. All reasonable men are called upon to familiarize themselves with the teachings of economics. This is, in our age, the primary civic duty. Economics deals with society's fundamental problems. It concerns everyone and belongs to all. It is the main and proper study of every citizen." End quote. In another occasion, he mentions the following, begin quote, "The fact that the majority of our contemporaries, the masses of semi-barbarians led by self-styled intellectuals, entirely ignore everything that economics has brought forward, is the main political problem of our age. There is no use in deceiving ourselves. American public opinion rejects the market economy, the capitalistic free enterprise system that provided the nation with the highest standard of living ever attained. If we want to avoid the destruction of Western civilization and the relapse into primitive wretchedness, we must change the mentality of our fellow citizens. We must make them realize what they owe to the much vilified economic freedom, the system of free enterprise, and capitalism. The issues of society's economic organization are every citizen's business. To master them to the best of one's ability is the duty of everyone." End quote. Living things and society are self-perpetuating orders that are in continuous cycles of wealth production and consumption. Production involves the transformation or relocation of matter to create wealth, and consumption transforms or relocates wealth in a way that sustains or expands living things and their internal parts or orders. The sun sends us photons, energy, which the process of photosynthesis is able to store in chemical form. This energy is then used to power the cycles of production and consumption. If there is more production than consumption, then the order is profitable and thus has additional wealth with which to sustain itself for longer periods and or grow. For example, paramecium are single-celled life forms that produce food wealth by swimming around and swallowing small bacteria, which they then consume by digesting and transforming them into the various nutrients wealth needed to maintain and expand the paramecium's internal order and thus life. A more complex multicellular animal like a person is simply a collection of cells, which are themselves orders, which must be productive as a whole in order to produce and then consume the necessary wealth needed to nourish itself and the suborders, organs, cells, organelles it is composed of. Today, we not only have biological order, we also have social order, Herbert Spencer's social organism, which is rapidly growing and increasing its rate of production. In other words, the rate at which it transforms the Earth's matter into human usable wealth, order, life, biomass. Every year, increasingly automated building-sized machinery in the mining industries scrape or mine less than 10 cubic miles of matter from the Earth's massive volume of 260 billion cubic miles. This matter is collaboratively transformed or relocated by billions of people as trillions of dollars worth of wealth in terms of cars, computers, buildings, products, etc. are produced, thus increasing the world's economic pie of wealth and social order. These continuous cycles of production and consumption require precise knowledge and information. By focusing on how information arises, spreads, and guides these cycles of production and consumption which lead to order-life society, we can have a simple yet profound understanding of how the entire world works. Just like the human body is the result of the actions of over 30 trillion cells which are coordinated by various systems, like the respiratory, nervous, and digestive systems, the global socioeconomic order is also coordinated by a system, by what economists of the so-called Austrian school, like Ludwig von Mises and his great protege 1974 Nobel Laureate in Economics F.A. Hayek, refer to as the market process. The market process and the parts it is composed of, like money, prices, economic competition, and interest rates, is the process that coordinates the actions of nearly 8 billion human beings in a manner that they produce more wealth than they consume so they get to live. In this introductory video, I'd like to very quickly go over a few vital economic aspects which every citizen should and can easily understand and later apply them to our current problems. We will discuss money, inflation, economic competition, prices, and the impossibility of socialism, the errors that led to the creation of communism in the Soviet Union, and then apply these things to our current coronavirus disaster and much that is related. Your life, the wealth you consume, the entire global economy, and thus all of human civilization, is the inadvertent result of a simple concept, or better said, tradition. The concept or tradition of private property. Private property means that a person owns and has the freedom to use his property as he desires or calculates. Our freedom to trade our private property with anyone in the entire planet transforms billions of free people into a global supercomputer where all companies are motivated to innovate and learn from each other, thus inadvertently cooperate to discover superior information with which to serve customers and reorder all of mankind. For example, it is the freedom of customers to buy electric vehicles with the latest technologies from any company in the world that motivates all other auto manufacturers in the world to copy and thus spread the latest and greatest innovations throughout the world. Companies that don't successfully compete, innovate, and learn won't get enough revenue to pay a competitive wage, motivating employees to once again use their freedom to trade, this time their labor, to quit and join the increasingly better informed, higher paying companies. This both competitive and cooperative process continuously innovates and reorders labor and resources in the most productive and prosperous way. Just like in the Olympics, we can discover the best athletes in the world due to global competition. So does free trade among all nations, peoples, orders allows the best ideas to compete and spread globally, thus ensuring the best possible global order. As cost-cutting ideas emerge and inevitably spread via competition, leading prices to continuously fall, new profitable ideas easily arise and once again spread via competition in an endless cycle of knowledge generation and innovation. For example, computers were once very expensive, but once the price of them came down enough, people easily realized that every home could have them, which gave birth to our computerized world and the internet and all the great things that flow from it. The more wealth is produced, the more wealth has to be offered in exchange for labor as entrepreneurs, companies, and orders in general compete against each other for the labor they need, which helps explain why the economic pie grows from everyone. We should also quickly add that morals are simply ways of acting. They are knowledge and information, which just like most knowledge, emerges and spreads via economic competition. Companies that hire, nourish, or trade with lazy, disrespectful, or corrupt people will be less competitive and be inevitably pressured to hire people with better morals, which in turn forces everyone to be respectful and hardworking regardless of race, sex, etc. Similarly, it is hardworking, tolerant, courteous people who, thanks to competition, inadvertently and inevitably force everyone else to be likewise. As Friedrich Hayek tells us, competition is, after all, always a process in which a small number make it necessary for larger numbers to do what they do not like, be it to work harder, to change habits, or to devote a degree of attention, continuous application, or regularity to their work, which without competition would not be needed. As millions of Italians, Britons, Germans, and other immigrants from all over the world came to America, it was ultimately the competition which grows from private property and thus individual liberty and freedom, which stripped these people of their otherwise nationalistic, ethnocentric, tribalistic identities and evolved what came to be seen as the classic American character or ethos of wanting to be seen as a reputable, honest businessman or professional who treats everyone with respect and wears a business suit as opposed to older religious, ethnocentric dresses. So not only does private property turn on or lead to economic competition on other aspects of the market process and result in social order and civilization, it also civilizes our morals. Governmental public sector orders, being coercive monopolies, which get their life and wealth through taxes and compulsion, are immune to this competitive information sharing and spreading incentives and pressures which motivate the private sector and companies to be efficient, innovative, and hardworking. This helps one understand how communism, which abolishes competing private companies and replaces them with a single competitionless monopolistic bureaucracy run by experts, leads to a massive lack in production and innovation and eventually socioeconomic chaos and starvation as the economic pie continuously shrinks, as has happened in every country that consciously attempts communism and socialism, like my native Cuba, or inadvertently drifts in that direction as their inefficient governments and public sectors get bigger and bigger and bigger, like the United States. Central plans can't work if people are free not to go along with them, so they inevitably require compulsion and tyranny. For example, it is a criminal act in a communist country like my native Cuba to start a business. In other words, to attempt a superior restructuring of society because it interferes with the plans of the quote-unquote experts who run the government. It is also a criminal act everywhere to not pay taxes that sustain public sector bureaucracies like public education. So there is little incentive or wealth to sustain other, more desirable, superior competing alternatives. For example, the New York City monopolistic school bureaucracy consumes about $29,000 per year to educate a K-12 student. Refusing to pay a single dollar that goes to this coercive bureaucracy is a criminal act. Taxes and all transfers of wealth from the private sector to government, besides being an obvious burden to the human beings that had to sacrifice a part of their lives to earn such wealth and now have less wealth to trade for the things they want, simply destroy the private sector jobs that taxed-away spending would have sustained in the private sector and replaces such productive and efficient and pie-increasing jobs for inefficient government ones, or worse, things like wars and militarism. The former Soviet Union had plenty of highly educated scientists and experts whose plans required the coercion of millions, but they were thoroughly crushed by free Americans and their competitive knowledge discovery as they worked hard towards the American dream. Socialist regimes and public sectors in general also face an incentive problem. In free societies or the private sector, each person or company is incentivized to be as productive as possible and keep inefficiencies to a minimum, since he owns and keeps the additional wealth or losses. On the other hand, the government employee or bureaucrat gets the same pay, ability to later consume, whether his department did a good job, produced a lot, or not, and is also not risking his own wealth, since that comes from the taxpayer. The image below is one of the most powerful means for explaining the difference between the competitive private orders, South Korea, and monopolistic government orders, North Korea. Again, keep your eye on how information arises, spreads, and continuously restructures the social order. Regulations are just information not subject to continuous improvement via competition, so they paralyze entire industries, driving up costs. Compare the increasingly regulated and paralyzed healthcare sector, which has grown from consuming about 5% of the American economic pie in 1960 to nearly 20% today, to the free and more competitive IT sector, where even the poorest of Americans can afford amazing technology. In the regulated, paralyzed healthcare sector, what a person must learn in order to legally offer medical advice via the licensing of doctors, where he must learn via the licensing of medical schools, what chemical compounds can be legally consumed, how to test drugs, how the medical insurance industry should work, and countless other gigantic bodies of knowledge and information are dictated by monopolistic, competitionless bureaucracies like the American Medical Association, the Food and Drug Administration, and numerous others. By comparison, the information technology sector has very few government regulations, so competition moves the creation and spread of superior information at breakneck speed, and is obviously transforming our world right before our eyes. Teenagers can work at Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and write the software that keeps planes in the sky or people alive via software and medical equipment. Yet there is no American Association of Computer Programmers dictating what or where such knowledge can be obtained, similar to how the government via the American Medical Association regulates, monopolizes, paralyzes the medical sector via the licensing of doctors, medical schools, insurance sector, etc. There is no government monopolistic bureaucracy ensuring the proper functioning of the software that runs PCs, smartphones, the internet, or ensuring the lack of malware or viruses in software. Freedom and competition in the software development industry is even quickly evolving our culture. It is increasingly seen as uncool and backward to have a traditional degree, where one wastes thousands of dollars and time physically attending gigantic temple-like universities, inefficiently professors instead of popular online videos you can pause and rewind, learning things that have nothing, like English 101, various history courses that are forced on you, learning things that have nothing to do with being a productive software, web, or IT professional. Thanks to this lack of monopolistic centralized decision-making, regulating, paralyzing, education in the software development and IT world is astounding. At places like www.freecodecamp.org, thousands of people are going from zero experience to highly paid computer programmers in just a few months for free. IT companies who reach a large enough size ultimately due to the great services they already provide, and therefore the useful and profitable knowledge that they contain, like Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and many others, go about creating their own competing educational institutions which train and test people using their products and technologies which are solving real problems and have been shaped by years of fierce competition and innovation. There are over 2.1 million individuals worldwide who have become Microsoft certified professionals by studying for and passing exams created by Microsoft. These exams change frequently to reflect the never-ending cycle of knowledge generation that exists in this freer and less regulated sector of the economy. Economic ignorance leads many to believe that since one has to be seemingly more careful with medicine, such monopolistic regulatory is somehow necessary. This is irrelevant. If it is superior information that is needed, which includes figuring out how careful to be, freedom and competition is the best way to discover it, period. My guess is that if the healthcare sector, or better yet, the entire worldwide economy was as deregulated, free, competitive as the software and IT sector, in a few months the cost of healthcare would drop by at least 80%, the rate of innovation and prosperity would skyrocket, and I would guess that people who as of today have 10 years left to live might be able to be dying of old age. Only the truly economically woke can easily accept the feasibility of this last statement. But human flight is obviously impossible, as we all know. In this image, we can easily see how the less regulated a sector is, the smoother competitive knowledge discovery functions. Thus, the quicker cost-cutting ideas and innovations spread, leading to continuously lower prices and better products in things like electronics and software, but higher prices and in the more regulated paralyzed sectors like healthcare and hospitals. Thus, we can see that freedom is the ultimate algorithm. It discovers the information that orders civilization, it civilizes our morals, is also indispensable for discovering the truth, and is the very opposite of coercion and tyranny. On to a few important concepts relating to wealth and money. Whenever a person works, he produces his labor and whatever wealth it creates, thus increasing the economic pie. If you're a freelancer, you produce a product, service, wealth, and trade it directly with society, customers, for money, and then trade the money back with society for the wealth you consume. If you work for a company, you produce your labor and trade it for money with your quote-unquote employer, who combines it with the labor of others to produce a product, service, wealth, which is then traded with society for the money from which your paycheck comes. Whether you are a freelancer, employee, or company, what is commonly referred to as sales revenue, your paycheck, is an estimate of the total amount of wealth produced. Costs, like employee wages, which will be used by them to consume food, energy, etc., are an estimate of how much wealth is consumed from the economic pie. And profits, which are the difference between sales revenue, production, and costs, consumption, are an estimate of by how much additional wealth the economic pie has grown. Again, a profitable order, whether it's a cell, a person, or a company, a profitable order is an order that produces more than it consumes and is therefore self-sustaining and alive. The global economy, or social organism, is really a vast collection of orders, people, companies that are constantly trading with each other, nourishing each other, each trade taking each participant or order from an inferior to a superior state of well-being from its own perspective. Otherwise, the trade would not occur. When Carl trades a dollar for a hamburger, he values the hamburger more than the dollar, and the restaurant values the dollar more than the hamburger. So the action of trading takes place, which, like all action which is not coerced, takes each participant from an inferior to a superior state of well-being. The more a person produces, the more he can consume. The wealthier a person, company, is, the more this entity has previously produced and exchanged for all this money and wealth. Bill Gates is one of the world's richest men because the social order he helped shape and successfully manage, Microsoft, has become one of the most productive in the world. We know this is the case because billions of human beings traded their money and wealth for its products and services. Now, very important. The production of wealth requires the consumption of wealth. For example, if 10,000 men are to spend 2 years producing an airplane factory, they must consume or use the concrete, materials, food, energy, transportation, shelter, wealth that they, as well as their dependents and family, need while they produce the factory. In other words, there can be no production if there does not already exist enough wealth that can be consumed while production takes place. More money does not equal more wealth. Imagine if everyone in the world suddenly had an extra $1 billion. Would this make society wealthier? No. The amount of real wealth, goods and services, has not increased by a single toothpick. It would actually lead to less wealth since many people would stop working and producing, seeing their newfound fortune. Would the 1,000 men above be able to produce the factory if instead of having real wealth to use and consume, had to consume pieces of paper with dead presidents on them? Of course not. More money just leads to higher prices. If 10 people in an island each have $10, so that there is a total of $100, can anything sell for $200? Of course not, because even if they all combine their money, there would still not be enough for the transaction to take place. What if each person has $1 million, so that there are now 10 million in total? Can something sell for $200 or $1 million? Of course. So for prices to go up, there has to be more money. And who creates the money that allows this? The government via their central banks, like the Federal Reserve in the United States. Next, I will say some things that criticize our mainstream economics establishment. Although you see me in front of a Federal Reserve building in a rather protest-like pose, I do not believe that the Fed and our mainstream economics establishment is some cartoonish cabal of bad guys. Not at all. What I do think is that they are very wrong, similar to how Karl Marx and the communists were wrong. Creating more money just means that there is more money per existing unit of real wealth, which just means higher prices per unit of wealth. The creation of money by governments is just a hidden tax that transfers wealth from savers and society at large to the people who get the newly created money. For example, let's say you have saved $1,000, which can buy you 1,000 items at $1 each. The government via the Fed and a convoluted process eventually creates billions of dollars which are given to the newly created Space Force military personnel so they can trade the dollars for the wealth they need to consume and live. And because of this money creation, prices go up 5% so that each item is now $1.05, and your saved or future earned 1,000 can only buy you about 952 items instead of 1,000. The 48 items or wealth, 5%, that you and other taxpayers can no longer obtain is the exact same amount of wealth that the Space Force personnel got to consume. Again, money is not the same thing as wealth. When governments create money, they are simply creating an additional tax or transfer of wealth from savers and the public at large to those who get the money. The following graph helps us understand how when the US was still on a gold standard, since gold can't be increased by adding zeros at the end of bars, this prevented the government from acquiring additional wealth taxes by just creating the money, thus prices had a slight downward trend until 1971 when the US completely abandoned the gold standard. To make a slightly longer story shorter, the US government went off the gold standard so that it could get additional wealth from the people who created, obviously, private sector workers and seniors who had saved, to increasingly transfer wealth to growing quantities of welfare recipients as well as military personnel for the Vietnam War. Had the government tried to obtain this wealth, not sneakily via money creation, inflation, but by more honestly raising taxes directly, chances are Americans would not have gone along. But from 1971 onward, the US government, thanks to the Federal Reserve, has been able to additionally tax worker savers, causing prices to rapidly increase instead of going down. If you look very carefully at the graph, you will notice two rapid increases in prices, one occurring during the American Civil War, 1861 to 65, and another during the First World War, 1914 to 1918. During wars, tribalistic politicians always resort to price-increasing money creation to acquire the wealth needed to feed, clothe, nourish the war effort. Because if they had to get the wealth via direct taxation, the public would more easily factor the true costs and suffering of the tribalistic warmongering and likely bring an end to such slaughters. This next graph shows how from early March to mid-May 2020, the Federal Reserve has created about $3 trillion, which will be given to people and businesses so that they can exchange this money for the wealth they need to consume. Some of this will be unemployment benefits, which will motivate many to not even look for work and thus continue to be pure consumers. Thus, overall, the $3 trillion is leading to a rapid shrinking of the economy and accelerating rise in prices. Again, the creation of money is just a transfer of wealth from workers, seniors, some, to others, as the economy continues to shrink and prices to rise. If the Federal Reserve continues to create money at this rate or faster, this will eventually lead to a hyperinflationary chaos, as happened in Germany after World War I, when the German government kept rapidly creating money, not wealth obviously, to pay for war reparations, military pensions to millions of wounded, and the countless things the economically ignorant population always expects governments to accomplish. Next, a few words about prices. How much wealth had to be consumed in order to produce a gallon of gasoline that sells in Seattle for $3.50, or a pound of beef that sells in a store in Miami for $5.35? We can't know for sure. However, we can be fairly certain that it was less than the advertised price, which on average must include the costs. The price of any item in the world lets us know that there is an order at that particular place and time that is coordinated by information that can produce the item while consuming less than the advertised price. That is amazing. This allows goods to be purchased and combined in a manner that ensures that the combination, like a car, can easily have a price set that properly accounts for the costs and consumption of the whole, like the car, by just adding the prices of the parts used to produce it, the wheels, the glass, the robotics, the labor, etc. Parts which themselves had a price set that included their own cost and consumption and so on. Each part input managed ordered by entrepreneurs with highly specialized time and place specific information who are always using profit and loss calculation to ensure that they are increasing the economic pie. The concept of private property plays a vital role here as well. It is not until things are privately owned that they are coordinated by brains or CPUs that are incentivized to use or reorder them in the most productive and profitable way possible. In order to have life, the social order must be coordinated by information that leads to more production than consumption. This information and coordination is impossible to achieve by governments and central planners, regardless of the genius of their experts or their good intentions. The following simple example suffices to show this. A restaurant in Miami sells a burger for $8. The $8 price provides vital information. Perhaps $1 might be profit, and $7 will be spending costs. In other words, in the necessary consumption or use of wealth needed to produce the burger, things like labor and everything the employees will consume at home, the food and energy, etc., thanks to their paychecks that came from the $7 per burger. Businessmen discovered 1. That there are enough customers nearby willing to patronize the restaurant at the $8 per burger price, thus providing a superior alternative to society. And he also discovered 2. How to reorder $7 worth of stuff, labor, supplies, etc., to produce the burger. If he sets prices too high, customers will choose other superior competing options. If too low, they might not cover costs and cause the business to consume more than it produces, leading to an overall shrinking of the economic pie and thus go out of business. Communism can't work because only businessmen dispersed throughout society are at the right time and place needed to discover people's desires and the information needed to properly set prices and thus create a profitable order. an order that produces more than it consumes. War is the absolute worst thing for the economy and mankind. Millions of people, previously employed or not, join the war effort by either killing fellow human beings and destroying wealth or working to create armaments, etc., thus increasing the economic pie by little in terms of civilian goods, and while they do so, they must consume food, energy, etc., real useful stuff, thus leading to an obvious overall shrinking of the economic pie in terms of useful civilian goods. They are all working, of course, but ultimately they are not ordered in a way that truly grows the economic pie with the wealth that makes life worth living and can be further consumed while producing more things. If military spending and full employment, thanks to it, were a good thing, then the militaristic Soviet Union and North Korea would have flourished. Mainstream Keynesian economists like Paul Krugman and proponents of modern monetary theory are totally clueless. John Maynard Keynes writes, quote, "Activity of one kind or another is the only possible means of making the wheels of economic progress and of the production of wealth go round again." End quote. Wrong. The activity must be coordinated in a manner that leads to more production than consumption, something only free individuals in the private sector could accomplish. Otherwise, you are obviously destroying the social order, which is precisely what war does. But the clueless mainstream economists, like 2008 Nobel Laureate in Economics Paul Krugman and the modern monetary theory proponents, do not understand this vital fact. So the erroneous belief that real savings wealth that business must consume while they produce can be created by central banks by just creating more money to then, quote-unquote, stimulate the economy, activity of one kind or another, even if you have zero regard for whether the people are ordered in a way that produces more than it consumes. These two fallacies provide the 1-2 punch of fallacies that keep the mainstream making the same errors over and over, culminating in the most horrific economic fallacy that could possibly exist. Once again, that war is good for the economy, and its corollary, that World War II is what got the United States out of the Great Depression in the 1930s. Consider the following absurdity by Paul Krugman. Krugman mentions, think about it. World War II, it brought us out of the Great Depression. If we discovered that, space aliens planning to attack, and we needed a massive buildup to counter the space alien threat, this slump would be over in 18 months. End quote. How can getting millions of people to consume, wear down existing wealth to produce weapons which are then used to destroy fellow human beings and their property be anything other than an obvious reduction in life, wealth, and order? Krugman's statement is the perfect example of what the great Ludwig von Mises once told students. Quote, "Don't be afraid to speak up. Remember, whatever you say about the subject, and however wrong it may be, the same thing has already been said by some eminent economist." End quote. We briefly summarize our progress. We have discussed how private property leads to freedom to trade, which turns on economic competition, which motivates the creation of superior information and circuit order, as well as shaping our morals. We have discussed production, consumption, economic calculation, the relationship between money and prices, how government money creation is just an additional tax that, like all taxes, transfer wealth, the inherent inefficiencies and perverse incentives found in government, and finally the impossibility of communism. We are now ready to understand how the same economic fallacies which led to the rise of communism in the Soviet Union are simply repeating themselves. It could be said that socialism, communism, is a complex of economic fallacies, which was almost bound to happen as the social order morphed itself from the easy-to-understand small farm towns of the pre-1800s to the bewildering growing complexity of the social order brought about by industrialization, worldwide free trade, competition, and capitalism. Without an understanding of what has just been discussed, most intellectuals of the 1800s and 1900s, with the best of intentions, just believed that a far more prosperous and quote-unquote just world could be achieved by central planning. Albert Einstein is perhaps the perfect example of a genius who, with the best of intentions, would use his reason to provide what is essentially a recipe for the destruction of civilization via his economically ignorant push for central planning and socialism. In his 1949 article titled "Why Socialism?" he writes, quote, "Technological progress frequently results in more unemployment rather than in easing the burden of work for all. The profit motive, in conjunction with competition among capitalists, is responsible for an instability in the accumulation and utilization of capital, which leads to increasingly severe depressions. Unlimited competition leads to a huge waste of labor. I am convinced there is only one way to eliminate these grave evils, namely through the establishment of a socialist economy, accompanied by an educational system which would be oriented towards social goals. In such an economy, the means of production are owned by society itself and are utilized in a planned fashion. A planned economy, which adjusts production of the needs to the needs of the community, would distribute the work to be done among all those able to work and would guarantee a livelihood for every man, woman, and child." End quote. Numerous disastrous economic fallacies can be found above. Quote-unquote, technological progress allows us to lower costs so more wealth can be created while consuming less, thus growing the economic pie. Technological progress has made it so that on average a single worker in the agricultural sector, thanks to the increasingly automated tractors and machinery, can create vast quantities of food, and competition between such farmers guarantees that they must innovate and copy each other's innovations, and that they must sell their food cheaply, competitively, so now the masses have more wealth to spend on other sectors, helping them grow, like the IT sector and everything else. We now have, since we don't have 80% of people working on farms like we did just a few centuries ago. The wealth that no longer sustains a job that has been lost to automation simply goes to sustain some other job, allowing us to easily afford more stuff. The stuff that got automated, plus the new stuff we spend our money and wealth on. Einstein is utterly clueless about the fact that the quote-unquote accumulation of wealth by savers and the much vilified rich and capitalists, thanks to the banking and finance industries, is borrowed by entrepreneurs and spent and consumed sustaining private sector jobs. It is important to realize, as the great economist Henry Hazlitt writes in his classic book, Economics in One Lesson, quote, "Saving, in short, in the modern world, is only another form of spending. The usual difference is that the money is turned over to someone else to spend on means to increase production." End quote. And that this increase in production has to be at least large enough to pay back the loan with interest. Taxing the rich just removes this wealth and the private sector jobs it would otherwise sustain and gives it to government, where it is inefficiently consumed while producing little in comparison, leading to massive relative losses. So as painful as it might be to admit for some, if Einstein can be so utterly clueless, we can hardly blame Lenin, Mao, Stalin, Roosevelt, and the countless others for the economic suffering they caused. Socialism, communism, viral economic fallacies did not spread and destroy much of the 20th century because of a few bad apples or tyrants. They first spread through the minds of well-meaning citizens and intellectuals like Einstein, which then gave the future leaders the moral and intellectual justification for their actions. Friedrich Hayek writes, quote, "It is necessary to realize that the sources of many of the most harmful agents in this world are often not evil men, but high-minded idealists, and that in particular the foundations of totalitarian barbarism have been laid by honorable and well-meaning scholars who never recognized the offspring they produced." End quote. Another Hayek quote. Most people are still unwilling to face the most alarming lesson of modern history, that the greatest crimes of our time have been committed by governments that had the enthusiastic support of millions of people who were guided by moral impulses. It is simply not true that Hitler or Mussolini, Lenin or Stalin appealed only to the worst instincts of their people. They also appealed to some of the feelings which also dominate contemporary democracies. End quote. And of course, the great von Mises. The intellectual leaders of the peoples have produced and propagated the fallacies, which are on the point of destroying liberty and Western civilization. The intellectuals alone are responsible for the mass slaughters, which are the characteristic mark of our century. They alone can reverse the trend and pave the way for a resurrection of freedom. Not mythical productive forces, but reason and ideas determine the course of human affairs. What is needed to stop the trend towards socialism and despotism is common sense and moral courage. End of Mises' quote. It is monumentally important that we see communism, central planning, and Lenin's Bolshevik revolution, which created the Soviet Union in 1922, as an almost inevitable spread of viral, self-reinforcing economic fallacies and incentives that were just bound to finally spark in a truly sustainable reaction. It wasn't just the economic fallacies, but a perverse incentive structure too. A young idealistic Russian could worry about how to make a good living in the always uncertain and competitive private sector, or by joining Lenin and his Bolsheviks, he could become a hero to mankind by just forcing the farmers to give up their grain to feed a bureaucracy of monopoly of experts who would plan a superior social order. Sign me up. Again, we must focus on how the ideas lead the slightly smarter apes into either carnage or civilization. We quote Mises again. It is ideas that group men into fighting factions, that press the weapons into their hands, and that determine against whom and for whom the weapons shall be used. It is they alone, not the arms, that, in the last analysis, turn the scales. End quote. Lenin was a great leader who had the strength to carry out his vision. An example of one of the orders he was sending to various cities districts to deal with the farmers, kulaks, who were rebelling against the grain requisitions went as follows. I quote Lenin. Comrades, the kulak uprising in your 5 districts must be crushed without pity. The interest of the whole revolution demands such actions, for the final struggle with the kulaks has now begun. You must make an example of these people. 1. Hang, and I mean publicly, so that people see it, at least 100 kulaks, rich bastards, and known bloodsuckers. 2. Publish their names. 3. Seize all their grain. 4. Single out the hostages per my instructions in yesterday's telegram. Do all this so that for miles around people see it all, understand it, tremble, and tell themselves that we are killing the bloodthirsty kulaks and that we will continue to do so. Reply saying you have received and carried out these instructions. Yours, Lenin. P.S. Find tougher people. End quote. The unproductive chaos, tyranny that Lenin was creating inevitably brought a gigantic famine that would claim about 5 million lives in 1921 and 1922. The majestic Black Book of Communism, Crimes, Terror, and Repression explains, I quote the book, despite the bad harvest of 1920, all grain stocks, even the seed for the future harvest, had been seized. Numerous peasants had virtually nothing to eat since January 1921. The mortality rate had immediately increased in February. In the space of 2 to 3 months, riots and revolts against the regime had effectively stopped in the province of Samara. Today, Bavilin explained, there are no more revolts. We see new phenomena instead. Crowds of thousands of starving people gather around the executive committee or the party headquarters of the Soviet to wait for days and days for the miraculous appearance of the food they need. It is impossible to chase this crowd away. Every day, more of them die. They are dropping like flies. I think there must be at least 900,000 starving people in this province. End quote. By Bavili. I continue the quote from the Black Book of Communism. Though perfectly well informed of the inevitable consequences of the requisitioning policy, the government took no steps to combat these predicted effects. On 30th July 1921, while famine gripped growing numbers of regions, Lenin and Molotov sent a telegram to all leaders of the regional and provincial party committees asking them to, quote-unquote, bolster the mechanisms for food collection, set up the propaganda for the rural appropriation, explaining the economic and political importance of the prompt payment of taxes, put at the disposal of the agencies for the collection of taxes in kind all the authority of the party and allow them to use all the disciplinary measures that the state itself would use. End of the book's quotes. Fortunately, other Bolshevik leaders helped Lenin accept relief from international organizations like the Red Cross, the Quakers, and future U.S. President Herbert Hoover's American Relief Association, whose combined efforts fed a whopping 11 million people each day. Lenin's anti-market and anti-production and thus anti-life order government control measures were such a disaster that by 1921, Lenin himself scaled some of it back in what came to be called the NEP, the New Economic Policy. The NEP essentially reintroduced some levels of private property and enterprise, especially for the farmers and kulaks, which immediately led to a better functioning of the market process and substantial increases in food production, 40% increase for 1921 to 1922. Among the numerous things to learn from this and similar disasters is the fact that it is understandably difficult for ideologues like Lenin and his governmental structure to change their minds, since not only do they have to admit to error, but to also realize that they have caused unimaginable suffering. This is just the kind of stuff the slightly smarter apes don't do that often. The incentives are to look the other way or to place the blame elsewhere. Even though Lenin was becoming aware of the chaos he was causing, he understandably had incentives to look for other causes, like saboteurs, the rich, capitalist exploiters, the religious, the church, who did not want to relinquish the power of authority. It was his economic policies that were intensifying the misery, but he would just double down, further intensifying it. Even though plenty of people knew communism would bring about unimaginable suffering, the rate at which the economic fallacies and ignorance and perverse incentives appeal to the tribalistic, slightly smarter apes was much faster than the rate at which the proper arguments against it could spread. One could say that the definitive knockout blow that proved the impossibility of central planning did not even exist until Ludwig von Mises wrote his, quote-unquote, economic calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth in 1920, far away and in a foreign language. Without sound economic arguments, which were also brief enough to be somewhat viral, much of mankind was doomed. The religious traditions of looking at the world's problems as the result of good versus evil did not work with the atheistic socialist communists, who, thanks to scientific progress, would discard religion-based moral arguments. In other words, mankind was stuck in what Mises referred to as the moral sphere. Mises writes, quote, "The rigid dogmatism peculiar to religious groups and to Marxism results only in irreconcilable conflict. It condemns beforehand all dissenters as evildoers. It calls into question their good faith. It asks them to surrender unconditionally. No social cooperation is possible where such an attitude prevails." End quote. Thus, the ideological battle between the atheist central planning by experts, viral fallacies, and inherited religious traditions continued, with religion, private property, and thus humanity suffering immensely. In the period between 1927 and 1940, the number of Orthodox churches in the Soviet Union fell from 29,584 to less than 500. The Soviet Union's anti-religious purges were equal opportunity. In 1917, there were over 20,000 Islamic mosques in the Soviet Union. By 1935, there would be less than 60. Thousands of priests would stick to their faith and quickly be shot. The atheistic nature of the Soviet Union obviously played a role in making it so much easier to discard human life and thus tremendously deadlier. In February 25, 1956, Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev, shook the world by admitting that, quote-unquote, the Great Terror, a political witch hunt that Stalin carried out 1936 to 1938 and led to the execution of about 700,000 people, had been based on lies, exaggerations, etc. He had to wait until Stalin's death to admit this mistake. However, it was not until Mikhail Gorbachev in 1991 that enough doubt and dissent emerged within the political structure and public in the USSR to finally put an end to the more textbook communist socialist intellectual error and resulting perverse incentives and relative tyranny that ruled that area since 1918. But the challenge did not end there. How do you get millions of people who have spent generations looking at a single bureaucracy to manage the social order and at least keep them alive to abandon that order maker and trust freedom and competition, especially if you were a mid to senior bureaucrat with low productive skill, or if you are one of the thousands upon thousands of quote-unquote educated scientists whose technical and scientific knowledge was simply not conducive to creating the things that free people, instead of communist bureaucrats, wanted. With the above in mind, we are almost ready to analyze our current situation. But first, a few words about World War I. In August 10, 1915, British physicist Henry Moseley, who would have probably won the Nobel Prize that year, died in perhaps the most disastrous error mankind has thus far made, the First World War, 1914 to 1918. Bright and pious German, French, British, Russian students, fathers, engineers, great minds, and experts, who even shared a common European Christian faith, reverted to their tribal ape-like nature and for God, honor, flag, and country, slaughtered each other, leading to about 18 million deaths. At 7:30 a.m. July 1st, 1916, the Battle of the Somme began. On this single day, just the British alone had about 20,000 fatalities and 35,000 wounded. On that day, a British soldier was either killed or wounded on average every second. The honor of a military career would lead to disproportionately higher losses for the upper classes for all belligerents. Germany's top general, Erich Ludendorff, would lose 2 sons, as would future British Prime Minister Andrew Bonar Law. British Prime Minister at the start of the war, Herbert Asquith, lost 1, while about 12% of British troops would die in the war. 31% of Oxford's 1913 graduating class would die. This should help abolish the popular naive myth that politicians are quick to bring about wars while wanting to avoid personal losses in them. Nonsense, unfortunately. We are dangerous tribal animals who have been butchering each other for millions of years. Segregating ourselves into groups for slaughter has been the norm. We shouldn't be shocked when men murder, rape, and torture, or masturbate to tentacle porn. The real miracle that has taken thousands of years of cultural legal evolution to create are the modern cultural values and laws we absorb that program us into respecting the body, property, thoughts of all men, of all human beings, regardless of age, sex, belief, and race. Being the slightly smarter apes that we are, fellow humans are our biggest assets, which help explain the evolution of altruism and compassion due to the great benefits we get at the group level and horrendous violence towards fellow men, since we are our biggest competitors. Given its importance, war and patriotism easily fills us with a great sense of purpose. England's Prime Minister during World War II and national hero Winston Churchill shows us how inspiring, exciting, and purposeful World War I was to him when he mentioned, "I think a curse should rest on me, because I love this war. I know it's smashing and shattering the lives of thousands every moment, and yet I can't help it. I enjoy every second of it." And in another occasion, Churchill mentions, "My God, this is living history. Everything we are doing and saying is thrilling. Why, I would not be out of this glorious, delicious war for anything the world could give me." Towards the end of World War II, Russia's Red Army is estimated to have raped over 2 million German women. Equally human, the Allies, Americans, weren't much better and generally saw the Japanese as an inferior race and cared little for their suffering or views. As US President who nuked Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Harry S. Truman mentions in a letter, "The only language they seem to understand is the one we have been using to bombard them. When you have to deal with a beast, you have to treat him as a beast." How can mankind build mind-bogglingly complex microchips, smartphones, the internet, and so much more, yet still not have figured out something as simple as peace? Why is it that every day at Microsoft, I interact with coworkers from Russia, China, Iran, Israel, yet our tribalistic governments are mired in conflict? Is there something to be learned from the fact that in July 1914 so many people, Henrys, leaders, experts, brainwashed themselves for 4 years into such needless carnage, yet hardly anyone today has the slightest clue why World War I was fought? Everyone in that tribal disaster died for absolutely nothing. Similarly, Is there something to be learned from the fact that with the best of intentions and guided by numerous bright intellectuals, millions during the 20th century fell for socialism, communism, thus inadvertently bringing unimaginable suffering upon themselves? And that to this day, hardly anyone in the entire planet knows why communism is 100% impossible to implement without it leading to socioeconomic chaos and famine? Yes, there is much to be learned. But for now, we will mention that human beings are dangerous tribal animals, whose economic ignorance, if not remedied in time, would lead to a final disaster. The relative freedom and socioeconomic prosperity that we have enjoyed in the West for just a few generations has been a slight cultural mutation from the law of the jungle our despotic and uncivilized instincts are very used to, and the coronavirus is in all likelihood one of these potentially totally man-made, tribalistic, and ultimately economically ignorant disasters like the prior two.
That if the politicians do not destroy the world in the next 20 years, there's good hope. But the chance that they will destroy the world in the next 20 years, I'm afraid, is fairly high.
We reach the present. We begin with the most important point. The economic fallacies and perverse incentives which critically led to the formation of the Soviet Union are still very much with us. New potential problems like global pollution, man-made environmental impacts, the alleged potential for some pathogen to spread via our interconnected world and wipe out millions of people, and numerous other concerns intensify and accelerate the spread of central planning fallacies. The overpopulation economic fallacy is also rapidly spreading and is one of the most dangerous. Mankind benefits from way more people, not less. In Hayek's words, quote, "The greater density of population, leading to the discovery of opportunities for specialization or division of labor, led to yet further increases in population and per capita income that made possible another increase in the population," and so on. End quote. Basically, the more brains, the smarter and more technologically advanced the global supercomputer becomes, making it easier to take care of the environment, and so on. Our transition from just larger-brained apes in our tribal world to market process coordinated global socioeconomic order or social organism is as significant in the evolution of life and the continuous increase in complexity of this on this planet as the transition from single cell to multicellular life which occurred about 1 billion years ago. Perhaps someday in the future, we could recreate the habitats of species that are dying now and bring them back to life. We are the saviors of all life in this planet, not the destroyers. I mean, we could be the destroyers. We are natural selection's latest and greatest creation. But again, without the proper understanding of the market process, we always fall for coercive and economically disastrous central planning. The fact that modern capitalism arose in Europe, which is populated by white people, is adding another polarizing element to the anti-capitalist sentiment. To one economically ignorant faction, many people who label themselves as Democrats or liberals, to these people, the political right, the Republicans, conservatives, is just the racist, quote, racist white man who uses capitalism to exploit and maintain the status quo for his benefit, and Donald Trump and all the other white conservative leaders are the perfect embodiment of this fact. End quote. I made that up. Yeah. That's pretty much it. It is so-called identity politics, where the racist white man oppresses and discriminates against various groups' identities, minorities, women, etc. And overturning such supposed political and economic oppression is what is needed to fix the world's problems by sharing more wealth and funding social programs that treat everyone fairly, equitably. Many white liberals, with the best of intentions, might be ashamed of the imperialist past of their ancestors or of the racism of their parents, uncles, etc., and erroneously believe that such past and racism is a significant factor in the relative underachievement or problems of other groups, minorities, blacks, etc. This is a gigantic error. The relative damage done by whatever racism towards minorities some racist white men might have is incomparable to and exacerbated by the horrendous economic ignorance that leads to things like minimum wage laws, the truly racist war on drugs, and resulting mass incarceration, the perverse incentives that arise out of numerous welfare schemes, and socialists share the wealth via massive government monopoly policies that the left liberals are constantly pushing. But since the left Democrats liberals do not understand economics, they are understandably focused on whatever racism they can and do find which further intensifies their misguided socialist economic policies, and blame of the white man, which understandably further increases the polarization that we're constantly seeing. If mankind survives the coronavirus-related socioeconomic chaos, it will be seen as another totally unnecessary man-made calamity based on the usual economic fallacies that led to communism and just sheer tribalistic hatreds, which the slightly smarter apes are easily susceptible to and kept them and their great leaders and experts slaughtering each other for 4 years during the First World War. Regardless of what exactly the CV pathogen is, and all the technical scientific details about it, the initial scare and lockdowns were based on a quickly revised and later totally discredited epidemiological model, which grossly overestimated the lethality of the coronavirus by British professor Neil Ferguson, who had made numerous totally bogus and exaggerated predictions before, like that up to 50,000 people would likely die from exposure to mad cow disease in beef in the UK, only 177 died. That up to 150 million people could be killed from bird flu, only 282 died worldwide during 2003 to 2009. That swine flu could lead to 65,000 deaths in the UK, only 457 died. That up to 150,000 people could die from foot and mouth disease scare. There were fewer than 200 deaths. We must highlight the fact that all of these so-called diseases, which led to such ultimately overhyped and totally unnecessary fears and restrictions like mad cow, bird flu, swine flu, foot and mouth, and ultimately the coronavirus disease as well, all seem to involve what we commonly refer to as viruses, which are so small that even with our best electron microscopes, their alleged functioning and interactions with the mind-bogglingly complex immune system remain the subject of much research and competing opinions. Wherever there is complexity, there is bound to be uncertainty. If the experts' understanding of these flus, pathogens, viruses, and our modern technology were anywhere as great as people assume, the much recommended flu vaccine would at least work on most people, but it does not even prevent the flu on less than half of the people who get it. By March 26, 2020, when the draconian lockdowns were just beginning in the USA, well-meaning scholars who never recognized the offspring they produced, like top US infectious disease expert Dr. Anthony Fauci, co-authored a paper in which he admitted, the case fatality rate may be considerably less than 1%. This suggests that the overall clinical consequences of COVID-19 may ultimately be more akin to those of a severe seasonal flu, which has a case fatality rate of approximately 0.1%. End quote. It quickly became obvious that the people who were dying were not necessarily dying because of coronavirus. They were simply testing positive for it at the time of death. And the overwhelming majority were very old and had multiple other illnesses and likely to die anyway. For example, a whopping 98.1% of the people who were labeled as dying from coronavirus in Massachusetts had at least one serious other health condition. In Italy, the average age was 78 years old and had almost 3 other serious illnesses. By early April, antibody testing, which helped identify people who had already dealt with the CV pathogen, quickly made it obvious that the lethality was that similar to a seasonal flu, yet the lockdowns intensified. Just like with communism, anyone could simply look and see that the non-communist countries were doing better. So could people easily see that countries like Sweden, Belarus, Nicaragua, Japan, and even within their own provinces, which might not have had lockdowns like South Dakota in the United States, were doing comparatively well or even better than lockdown countries. By May 26, 2020, official stats reached over 100,000 deaths from coronavirus in the United States, many of which were fraudulent. For example, even the Washington state government has admitted that people dying of gunshot wounds have been counted as coronavirus deaths. One could easily hypothesize that the true lethality is easily less than 10% of the 100,000 given the above, what has just been mentioned. There are many other factors that can easily show that the number is much smaller, but I will not even go there. So after 3 months of corona hype, 99.997% of Americans have survived the pandemic. Yet over this completely overhyped tribalistic runaway complex of fallacies and perverse incentives, not only is the USA heading towards socioeconomic chaos as a bunch of economically ignorant politicians try to cope with 41 million unemployed, a dangerous horde of tribal politicians want to blame and nearly start a war with China over this as well. Just like perverse incentives had young Russians joining the Bolsheviks and inadvertently expanding central planning misery, so is the coronavirus scare. Many people with good intentions believe that even if there is a significant economic price to pay, that if the lockdown saved lives, it would have been worth it, especially those who have government jobs like public school teachers, etc., who get to be heroes and take a taxpayer-funded vacation at the same time. Just like during World War I, the wise people who knew that there was no need to run across trenches for God and country to slaughter fellow human beings were sent to prison for desertion. And the communists killed people who didn't want to go along for being selfish and not wanting to share the wealth equally, etc. We see the same tribalistic mentality among many in their desire to vilify those who just want to go back to work and feel like all of this is just one big mistake. So what must we do? We must become Misesians. We must understand basic economics and help fellow citizens overcome the economic fallacies that plunge us into tribalistic wars and socioeconomic order destroying central planning. If we are to have a worldwide free market intellectual revolution that can quickly save mankind and reach the amazing peace and prosperity we are truly capable of, and in a matter of months, not years or generations, we must find, join, persuade people who are thoroughly convinced that such quick prosperity can be achieved and thus become beacons of hope, excitement, and viral economic education. We must join Mises and go over the parapet in his quote-unquote intellectual battle against the economic ignorance that threatens civilization. As Mises writes, everyone carries a part of society on his shoulders. No one is relieved of his share of responsibility by others, and no one can find a safe way out for himself if society is sweeping towards destruction. Therefore, everyone, in his own interest, must thrust himself vigorously into the intellectual battle. None can stand aside with unconcern. The interests of everyone hang on the result. Whether he chooses or not, every man is drawn into the great historical struggle, the decisive battle into which our epoch has plunged us. Just like socialism, communism, and our big government problems are caused by viral economic fallacies and resulting perverse incentives that inadvertently lead to bigger government growth and thus more coercion of wealth from the private sector, so too should we focus on viral bits of economic wisdom. It would seem wise to focus on those ideas that can both explain the most as quickly as possible and also cause enough doubt on what the current crop of clueless experts are recommending, essentially more regulation, planning, and central bank socialism by creating money to manage the social order. Henry Hazlitt wisely identified a focus on the basics of monetary policy and inflation because it is easy to understand, teach, and immediately lets people know that it is the central banks that are responsible for the inflation, rising prices, and general growth in government. Hayek's focus on how competition leads to spreads information and superior order and how governments prevent or slow down this process is also easy and a powerful way to get people closer to the proper understanding of how private property leads to economic freedom, which leads to competition and superior order. There is no reason why famous athletes and movie stars and others of influence can't understand basic economics and be likewise motivated to spread the econo-gospel. Unimaginable peace and prosperity are just around the corner. We just have to help our fellow citizens lose the fear of economic freedom and thus economic ignorance. The bigger the tax cut, the bigger the job losses and wages in the public sector will be, but just as quickly, the bigger the job gains and wages will be in the private sector, as taxpayers now have that additional wealth to keep and to now spend in the private sector, thus expanding it. All that will happen is that a public sector employee loses his public sector job and quickly finds a private sector one. Instead of getting his paycheck and wealth by coercing the taxpayer as part of a massively inefficient government monopoly and thus providing very little in return, he now joins a much more productive private sector order or company that is growing, hiring, because taxpayers are now giving them more business, money, wealth with which to hire and sustain him. All wealth that is given by government has to be taken away coercively or sneakily via inflation from others who in a sense gave up a part of their lives to produce it. Whenever you get something from the government, you are essentially consuming another person's life and order. This is not some moralist crusade against government. We just want to understand and minimize such inefficient coercion, which when properly understood, most of us will find it immoral. The better the people understand economics, the more they will be willing to go along with these transitions to skyrocketing prosperity, even those who currently have relatively well-paying government jobs. Again, economic education is the key. Besides viral economic education, perhaps the three most pressing issues confronting us now are: the tribalistic warmongering with China must be calmed. Just like with World War I, at some point any talk about peace and getting along will just be seen as treason. This is what the apes always fall for. You can be sure that the war is good for the economy fallacy is spreading through the minds of the economically ignorant, slightly smarter apes that run all governments, especially as the coronavirus-related socioeconomic disaster intensifies. Citizens must be awoken to the real pressing danger that nuclear war is. The next 2 minutes are a wonderful discussion about this danger by Noam Chomsky, discussing Daniel Ellsberg's great book about nuclear war, The Doomsday Machine.
I learned and did not know that during the Eisenhower period, and this basically carried on, there was one war plan. And the war plan was that if there was a confrontation with the Russians in Berlin, whatever, maybe a small confrontation, then immediately we wipe out every city in China. I mean, the enormity of that idea takes a while to sink in. There was no alternative plan. That was the plan then. Tried to develop alternative plans, but something like that remains. And a war could be set off just by inadvertence. There's case after case, many are discussed in the book, where we came extremely close to war just by inadvertence. Sometimes reckless actions on the part of leaders, but sometimes just accidents that happen. So one example that I didn't know that comes out in the book is that when the first early warning system was established to detect incoming missiles, which would have been 1958, I guess, approximately.
1960.
60, yeah. Turns out in this new sophisticated system to detect incoming missiles, in the first week of operation,
First day when it was
first
turned
day
off.
of operation,
Turned it off.
First day of operation, it detected a Russian missile attack with 99.9% certainty. First day of operation. And fortunately, nobody paid attention. But that kind of thing happens over and over, and the war plans are set up so that if somebody acts on that 99%, a billion people die. I mean, this is what we've been living with for 70 years. This is what we've been living with, and the page after page of the book contains graphic examples of this kind of, you can only call it insanity. And in fact,
Second, the 40+ million unemployed can get back to work and on a path to unimaginable peace and prosperity in a few weeks. What is the problem we are trying to solve? We need to order those 40+ million in a manner that they are guided by the most productive knowledge, so that they produce as much wealth as possible, so that they can consume and enjoy as much wealth as possible. The only way to discover how to do this is via economic freedom. Right now, I could easily hire 50 people in my building for $1 an hour and rent them out to give massages, do laundry, deliveries, etc. However, competition from other entrepreneurs, brains, CPUs, who have superior time and place specific information would pay them more and thus lure them away from my inferior and less productive plans, so that very quickly everyone would be incorporated in the most profitable plans the millions of competing brains can come up with. It is, of course, vitally important that minimum wage laws are abolished, so we allow all profitable ideas and restructurings to occur. The coronavirus lockdowns have led to more consumption than production, thus obviously shrinking the economic pie. The less seed a farmer has to plant for the next crop, the smaller the crop will be. Since there exists less wealth, the wealth that can be traded for people's labor will be smaller, and therefore people should expect lower wages. Most of the 40+ million people who have lost their jobs would probably be able to work in the same companies as before if they are wise enough to accept correspondingly lower pay. Most of us have been made poorer. We will have less wealth to trade for meals at restaurants, which means less wealth and revenue for restaurants and correspondingly smaller wages if they are to remain profitable and in business. Since many businesses, especially restaurants, already pay minimum or close to minimum wages, many will not be allowed to lower wages and have to stop producing altogether. Once again, minimum wage laws must be scrapped. When a business like an airline goes bankrupt and ownership assets are now in the hands of creditors, What usually happens is that the creditors are motivated to sell the business to a competitor who is likely to have the best ideas, information, leading to profitable use of resources, labor, and will thus typically be the highest bidder for the old airplanes and business. That's all. Financiers and investors take losses, and often employees also see their wages reduced as part of a now profitable company order. Economic education is obviously the most important thing needed to allow the necessary freedom for this to happen. Third, the disastrous and racist war on drugs must be ended immediately and everyone in jail because of it freed. A proper understanding of economics is vital for really understanding the immense cancer that this is in society, and especially African Americans. Many people like mind-altering substances, drugs, alcohol, etc. Mankind always has, and they have played an important role in cultural evolution, since getting high was an important way to interact with the spirit world, which played a vital role in the emergence of our religions, rules, laws, etc. Since many drugs are outlawed, but people still want them and are thus willing to trade money for them, their cost has to pay for the additional risks and consumption involved in their production, like the concealment, bribes to corrupt cops that will look the other way, and much more. This is why a kilogram of cocaine that may cost $200 to produce in a Bolivian jungle might sell for $20,000 in New York City. The relative higher price needed to cover such costs and consumption inevitably motivates people, especially poorer and less educated people, to enter the drug production and trafficking business. Eventually, these people get busted, which now forces taxpayers to pay over $31,000 per inmate, over $60,000 in California, and in New York City it is a whopping $168,000 per year to keep each drug dealer and user in jail. From 1984 to 1996, California built 21 new prisons and only one new university. In 2006, there were 1,889,810 drug-related arrests, of which almost 830,000 were related to just marijuana, which is relatively harmless and much less so than alcohol. Just try to imagine all the wealth that is consumed from society as we feed, clothe, and equip the criminal industrial complex as it does this useless function. Each drug bust and jailing of dealers, producers simply reduces the supply of drugs, which means that there is a smaller amount of wealth being chased by the same amount of money, so that their price simply goes up, once again increasing the motivation for people to become drug producers, traffickers, and dealers. This is a cycle that never ends, and has nearly 500,000 Americans in jails at an enormous cost to taxpayers and causing horrible suffering and misery in poor Latin American countries where powerful drug cartels and businesses emerge, because the cost to not only manufacture the drugs is smaller, but to also avoid, bribe, terrorize the local police and citizens, which explains why countries like Mexico have so much drug-related violence. The US government further intensifies the suffering by taxing and taking wealth from Americans, to then arm and train the police in those countries to help crack down on the cartels, leading to brutal mini-civil wars. If drugs were legalized, instead of having millions of people consuming billions of dollars worth of wealth as they made a living doing the expensive and deadly aforementioned activities, cartels, prisons, you would simply get a small increase in the people employed in the pharmaceutical and agricultural industry, lowering their price to that of your average multivitamin. The money saved by drug users and taxpayers, since jails would no longer be needed, would now get spent in other areas, increasing employment and wages in those industries. The war on drugs allows racist white cops to inflict immense harm on the black community. Regarding the police abuse and racism, I'll just read a few revealing quotes. Harry J. Anslinger, the nation's first drug czar, before Congress in 1937 said, quote, "There are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the US, and most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz and swing, result from marijuana use. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes." End quote. Similar interracial fears were at play in some of our very first drug prohibitions, in this case involving opium and the Chinese that brought it over here. In San Francisco in 1875, when the city of San Francisco passed the first laws aimed at prohibiting drug use, I quote, "The roots of this ordinance were racist rather than health-oriented, and were concerned with what today is known as lifestyle. Opium smoking was introduced into the United States by tens of thousands of Chinese men and boys imported during the 1850s and 1880s to build the Great Western Railroads. The Chinese laborers then drifted into San Francisco and other cities and accepted employment of various kinds at low wages, giving rise to waves of anti-Chinese hostility. Soon white men and even women were smoking opium side by side with the Chinese, a lifestyle which was widely disapproved. The San Francisco authorities, we are told, learned upon investigation that, quote, many women and young girls, as well as young men of respectable family, were being induced to visit the Chinese smoking opium dens, where they were ruined morally and otherwise. End quote. Again, there's much to discuss here, but just racism is really allowing and motivating these cops to inflict immense harm, and this war on drugs just must be ended immediately. It really gives us an opportunity to further help explain how an understanding of economics is vital for making sense of all of these disasters. Again, economic education is the key. As I wrap things up here, I'd like to read what else? Another Mises quote. The body of economic knowledge is an essential element in the structure of human civilization. It is the foundation upon which modern industrialism and all the moral, intellectual, technological, and therapeutical achievements of the last centuries have been built. It rests with men whether they will make the proper use of the rich treasure with which this knowledge provides them, or whether they will leave it unused. But if they fail to take the best advantage of it, and disregard its teachings and warnings, they will not annul economics. They will stamp out society and the human race. Please visit votebesada.com to learn more about my congressional campaign. If you would like to help my campaign and help spread an understanding of economics, please share this video, especially to famous and influential people, and like and follow my campaign's Facebook page. I am running in Washington's 9th District, which includes offices of today's leading IT companies like Amazon, Google, and Microsoft. If we can just get the increasingly influential and powerful software world to truly understand economic freedom, we will finally triumph in our intellectual battle.